All right, hello and welcome back, everybody, from Psychology 200. I hope you're all hanging in there. I hope you're keeping up with everything and that all of your classes are going fairly well. What we're going to be doing today is actually really closing out a lot of the topics that we've been discussing over the previous weeks. There is still a few more lectures left, two more to be precise, on things that are kind of adjacent to what we've been looking at. But what we're going to be doing in this lecture is finishing up with a lot of the research designs and general goals that we have when we're conducting research. And because of that, I do have to warn you in advance, this video is going to be a little bit longer than some of the previous ones that we've had. Usually in class, when we do this in person, I kind of just expect to get through as much of it as possible, knowing there's going to be extra discussions and questions, and have a lot of it kind of bleed over into the next class, which is going to be a little bit shorter. So please stick with me as we're trying to get through this, and if you need to take a break, feel free to do so. There's no needs to power on through this if you feel like you're kind of losing track of what we're talking about or just need to do something for a little while in between. So let's get started with today's topic. As I mentioned, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is really closing out the stuff that we've been discussing in the past. In particular, we're going to start the first half of this class out by closing out the different types of what we call quantitative research that people doing studies can conduct. When they're doing this quantitative research, remember when we involve multiple variables, we're often running what's called relationship research. Now, relationship research can be correlational. We talked about that in previous classes. In fact, I think it was just the previous one that we looked at it in. And it could be potentially comparison research, where we're looking at different groups, which are levels of an independent variable, and how those groups vary across averages on some dependent variable of interest. Now, there's lots of extra nuances to comparison research and correlational research that you'll get into in future semesters, but what we've covered thus far is really the key elements that you're expected to know in terms of these two sets of research that many people do sometimes conduct. But what about the other type of quantitative research that we said sometimes people run studies on? What we sometimes call descriptive research, where we're no longer comparing groups or looking at correlations. We're just talking about averages or spreads of scores on one specific variable within a population of interest. A classic example of this, again, could be something like the average speed of a cheetah, or how much milk somebody can drink in an hour, or how tall the average NBA basketball player is. These numbers that we're reporting don't involve multiple variables. Notice it does involve multiple measurements, but there's not multiple things that we are actually measuring within each individual that we're studying. And it doesn't involve some statistical comparison or analysis. We are still technically collecting averages. We're often reporting spreads, what we call standard deviations, but that's about as far as we go with this type of research. It doesn't mean, though, that descriptive research doesn't have its utility. In fact, what I like to do in class after we talk about descriptive research is then have people get into groups and talk about some things that they've learned over the past week or two from the news or other places that they found extremely interesting. And what most people tend to report are kind of random, obscure facts. Now, for most of you right now, I'm guessing lots of the facts that you'd be reporting relates to the coronavirus outbreak and some of the different things that you've learned. And my guess is that when you do report these facts and talk about these things, a lot of the interesting things that you talked about probably are coming more from descriptive research than comparison research. Oftentimes, just talking about average is sufficient and interesting to a lot of individuals. And that really speaks to how valuable this type of research can be, even if a lot of the statistical tools that you'll learn later aren't necessarily incorporated into these designs. So how do we run this descriptive research? As I mentioned, more often than not, what we're doing in our descriptive research is reporting things like averages and spreads. And that means most descriptive research involves collecting information about a large number of individuals through either what we call observational research design or what we sometimes will do what's called survey research design. Honestly, survey research design has kind of taken on observational research design in terms of its popularity over the last couple decades. So we are going to pay attention to both of these types of descriptive research designs. We're going to focus our attention first on what we call observational research designs. We will later on get to a special type of descriptive research called a case study, where we go away from talking about a group or a population and instead start focusing in on a specific individual. And these case studies will also allow us to kind of merge some of those time series designs that we talked about before with individual studies or descriptive studies that we're interested in. But that's for a later time. What we're going to do again is focus first on a very specific type of descriptive research called the observational research design. I do love the name observational research designs because it gives us kind of a sense of what the key elements to observational research is all about. For those of you that want a little bit clearer understanding of what observational research is about, I usually start talking about this particular topic by referencing a very famous observational researcher, somebody that many of you have probably heard of, and I'm guessing some of you can even recognize in this image. For those of you that don't know who this picture's of, it's actually of a very famous researcher named Jane Goodall. And there's a video link that I put up here that I'm hoping is not dead, that you can watch if you would like that kind of highlights the work of Jane Goodall and why her contributions to the field of science and psychology and biology were really so monumental. But at the heart of it, and this is what I want you to understand when watching the video, is just the observational approach. Goodall did not necessarily compare many groups. She wasn't statistically uh, adept. She didn't run many big analyses. Her job and her focus as a researcher was to just observe and report general findings of what she was seeing. And that doesn't minimize necessarily her impact that she had on the field. In fact, she has had a huge impact on science for many decades, even though she wasn't doing a lot of the statistical techniques that we're going to be learning about in future classes. And that really highlights the recognition that we have to have for kind of the value of this observational approach. Right? It's not a lesser approach. It's just one that doesn't involve some of the tools that we've been looking at so far. And if you're looking at what it's at the heart of Goodall's research, or really any research that involves this observational approach, well, what we're looking at here is research that focuses on overt behavioral observations. Right? It's what really separates observational research from survey research, where we're not just asking people how they're feeling or what's going on, but instead we're just recording what's actually happening in the environment, the behaviors that we're seeing. Now, some of the times when we're running these observational approaches, we are just, as you can see in the image, counting what it is we're seeing. How many times does somebody do something like touch their face, or how many times does somebody have this specific type of interaction? That's a very common type of observational approach, especially in psychology. But sometimes we shift from just measuring how often something is happening to how much or what percentage of the time something's actually happening. And this is what we call the durational method. There's a lot of research in developmental psychology that looks at peer development and parental interactions that doesn't focus necessarily on how many times a parent's doing something or peers are doing something, but just the percentage of the time that they're committing to a specific type of behavior or specific type of general actions. This durational method isn't necessarily something that's used everywhere in the observational approach, but in certain areas, certain facets, it's actually more useful and more commonly used than the frequency method. Another one that's kind of interesting is what's called the interval method, where you might measure the number of occurrences that occur in different situations. You could, in this interval method, say, look at the number of times somebody is participating, but make sure that you're counting the number of times that person's participating when they're in, say, different classrooms or different settings in their life. kind of getting a sense of how often something's happening, but also kind of taking into account that different situations might evoke different types of behaviors. In total, though, all of these different approaches are part of the observational approach. And when we do these things, we can garner a lot of really interesting information about individuals or populations that we're interested in. In terms of how we're actually measuring these behaviors, there's actually lots of different ways that we can conduct our studies. The most classic example of what's done in observational study was the Jane Goodall work, which was touted as being what's called a naturalistic observation. That's the third one down in the list for those of you following along. Goodall's work, though, if we're looking at it a little bit more critically, would probably not be a great example of naturalistic observations because she did actually interact with the chimpanzees, with many of the other animals that she observed during her stay in their area. And instead, what she really was probably doing is what was called participant observations, where she went into the environment of the thing that she was actually measuring and observing, but through interaction, she got a more complete understanding of what was going on. Now, participant observations have a lot of utility, but there is also some issues that arise with this participant observation, where maybe you're not getting, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, genuine behaviors, because the researcher or the observer might be shifting or altering the behavior of the observed simply because of their presence or certain things that they're actually doing. Another thing that's very similar to this participant observation approach is what's called the contrived observation studies, where there are actually participants brought into studies and then they're observed. The classic example of a contrived observation study is Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situation that she ran to kind of look at attachment types of young children when she put them in these different environments in the lab that involved the presence and absence of the mother and this introduction of a stranger and certain things within the room. There was an observational component to it, but the researchers were overtly present, and there was kind of a controlled environment that these people were being observed in. Now, these types of observational studies, the naturalistic observation study, the participant observation study, and the contrived observation studies, are primarily the ways that psychologists and other social scientists run their observational studies. But if we're looking at information about, say, past generations or want kind of a historical perspective on things, there are two other types of observational studies that can be conducted. One particular one, which is kind of interesting, is something called a content analysis, where you look through media outlets like stories or movies or television shows to kind of understand roughly how a group or how a population was behaving, say at that time or in that location where the researcher couldn't necessarily be located. My favorite example of this is research that looks at gender biases or perceptions of specific groups by watching films and television shows from decades ago to get a general consensus of how people were treated in those shows to understand kind of the underlying biases or perceptions that people in society probably had. Now, obviously, if we're looking at this from, again, a critical perspective, we have to be leery of doing this particular type of analysis. Maybe people aren't representing the entire population very well in a television show or movie, or maybe even the writings of an individual that we're using in these content analyses might be sort of edited with the recognition that even if there's a persistent thought or behavior, it's not appropriate to necessarily say or do those things. So there are limitations to these content analyses, but what they do allow researchers to do is go to places or times that they couldn't necessarily access themselves to still get a better sense of what some underlying behavior or perception of that group of interest actually was. Now, something very similar to this is what's called archival research. The key difference here is you're not looking through media outlets, but instead looking through historical records to get a sense of how often something was happening or what kind of the underlying theory or approach to something was at a specific time. So if you're maybe looking at, say, aggressiveness towards certain groups of people, you wouldn't watch media outlets like you would in a content analysis, but instead you'd look at crime reports or statistics about, say, the amount of times that something was done to a specific group of individuals. That's what archival research is about. And it again allows researchers to go to places or times that they couldn't necessarily go to themselves and still do something akin to an observational study. So it's one that you do want to just sort of be mindful of, but understand also what is different about it, and it also, much like the content analysis, some potential shortcomings that come along with this type of approach. And this is something that really is kind of a concern that I want us to have for all these types of observational studies. Right? Many people tout observational studies as these extremely valuable tools to get insights as to how a group works. But there's lots of things that can be problematic with these types of studies. And I think sometimes schools and other institutions do kind of enhance the perception that these things are perfectly fine when in reality there are some issues that arise. One of the classic issues that we have with observational studies is that people sometimes observe or kind of assess things in a way without really considering the group that they're observing. There's even boards that argue that if you're running observational studies where you're just reporting the overt behaviors of people you don't know, there's no need to concern yourself with whether or not you get the approval of the people that you're observing or watching. And there has been some pushback over the years about whether or not that's a truly ethical philosophy, whether or not people do reserve the right to privacy, even if they're acting in some environment in the community. And this is something that's still a persistent conversation that's going on. And what's related to this is also the fact that once people do start to recognize that they're being observed or they're brought into a lab, if we're talking about, say, the contrived observational studies, is that sometimes people could behave just in ways that are kind of atypical from the way they would behave in most situations. Now, sometimes this can relate to something we've talked about before. This is a part of experimental studies as well, these things called demand characteristics, where people shift their behaviors just because they're in an experiment to either confirm or kind of debunk the study that they're a part of. And this is always, when we're talking about demand characteristics, kind of an intentional thing. Something also related to this in observational studies is this possibility that people might just start concealing things that they recognize they don't want others to see them doing when they participate in a study, not because necessarily they want to confirm or debunk the research, but simply because they don't want those behaviors, those things linked to them when they're a part of the study. And this brings up a really key element to many observational studies, and it's this need for something that many researchers call habituation, where the observed need to kind of get acclimated to being observed before you start recording or kind of observing the behaviors of the individual as if you were conducting your study. My favorite example of this are those reality television shows like Road Rules or some of the other ones, the Real World that MTV and other groups used to make, and there's still ones like this today, like Big Brother, where people will come into a house and they'll act kind of an odd way for the first couple days. But as the newness of the situation starts to decline, their behavior starts to shift. Now, there are questions whether or not their behavior is shifting back to what it was originally like. It might just be they're taking on new roles, but most people have argued that, after the first week or two on these shows, people start acting a little bit more like they behaved before they got on these shows because they're getting acclimated to the cameras, they're getting acclimated to the interviews, and starting to manifest behaviors that are more representative of themselves. Whether or not that's true in those shows is, again, debatable, but this is definitely true in most observational studies. If you give participants time, if you give people that you're observing time to actually just get acclimated to being observed, you're probably going to get more genuine natural behaviors. And this is why having kind of a cooling off period is always suggested when people do run these observational studies and are noticeable. Another thing that can sometimes happen in these observational studies, because it is observational in nature, that's kind of the definition of the name, is that observers themselves, researchers themselves, might have issues with subjectivity. Oftentimes, this is because what we're recording is more ambiguous than we think. Let's say we're recording numbers of social interactions that people have, or the number of aggressive behaviors that people display. Social interactions can consist of a lot of different things. Is eye contact the equivalence of a social interaction, or do you need some type of verbal back and forth before it counts as a social interaction? And what about whether or not people touch each other? Is kind of a handshake or pat on the back another indicator of a social interaction? It's not clear. Same thing with aggressive behaviors. What constitutes a truly aggressive behavior? Sometimes it involves gray zones, and trying to figure out how you're going to set those when you're running your observational studies is sometimes difficult. And oftentimes it's also even more challenging because researchers do go into studies with some preconditioned bias that you're going to see X amount of aggressive behaviors or social interactions within a specific group. And those preconceived notions can already exacerbate something that could be an issue, even if there's no bias involved. So, what lots of researchers are encouraged to do if they're running observational studies is have multiple observers. And that way, you can check for the reliability and validity of things by measuring what we talked about earlier called inter-rater reliability, where if you've got extremely reliable measures, you're giving yourself a better chance at validity. We talked about the need for reliability before we have validity. And that kind of reliability that you can get from these inter-rater scorings can also verify that there isn't as much bias or subjectivity in the observations of a person simply because that they're looking for something specific. Obviously, if both observers have the same bias, these inter-rater scorings can sort of be less useful. But overall, they're better than nothing, and this can really help with that specific problem that is a key issue with these observational studies. The other option that we have, if we recognize that observational studies are not perfect for us and we still want to run descriptive studies, are these things that we call survey research. Now, survey research has a litany of different issues with it because people are providing kind of responses that give them more time to figure out what's going on. There's a lot more chance to have loaded questions, but they can sometimes get to things that aren't overtly observable in the environment. So if we're looking at the kind of the history of psychology research on these descriptive studies, what you'll often find is there's probably just as many, if not more, survey research designs done by psychologists as there are observational studies. And the types of information that we can accumulate in these survey designs come in a variety of different forms. One of the classic examples of surveys that used to be conducted in the past were these things called open-ended surveys. In fact, if you look at a lot of historical research on things like motivation and memory and attention and all of these key elements to the mind, most researchers in the old days, in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, tended to run open-ended studies where they try to understand how perception works or how we're driven to do things by just asking a bunch of people and getting kind of a theme, a consensus from the open-ended responses that people provide. The problem with these particular types of approaches is they're not very scientific, especially if somebody has a specific bias in mind as they're administering these surveys, or even if they're asking questions that definitely push people in specific directions. So we tend to kind of avoid these things unless we're just exploring something brand new where we don't know where it's going to go. Instead, focus our attention nowadays on what we call restricted studies or rating scale studies. Or oftentimes these rating scale studies in psychology are just called Likert scale studies. Now, restricted studies involve people kind of having a couple different options for how they feel about something or what they want people to kind of understand about them. The classic example of this is just yes, no questions. Do you live in this place? Have you done this particular thing? Where it's just a yes, no option. If we're looking for multiple choice things, it could be like, what group are you a part of out of these groups? Or, how do you kind of spend the majority of your time doing this, or this? Those restricted questions are a little bit easier to analyze, especially the yes no ones. It's a little bit more difficult with some of the kind of multiple choice ones that we're running, but there's definitely a lot more scientific utility to these restricted studies if you can run them. Of course, forcing people to answer in specific ways might get you to miss out on some key things that you could get from those open-ended studies. So it's not always perfect in terms of that versus open-ended studies. So you got to consider kind of the situation that you're in. Grading scale studies are very similar. It's just for these, or what sometimes again called Likert scale studies, you're not asking people different options, but instead you're giving them these scales. The classic examples is on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being always and 5 being never. How often do you do blank? Or on a scale of 1 to 7, how do you feel about this? 1 being I hate it, 7 being I love it. There's lots of kind of random debates if you get into the statistics of these things about whether or not your Likert scale should be from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, talking about what's called statistical power and representativeness, whether or not people can really differentiate between some of the nuances of larger spans of scores. But for now, just understand you don't have to obsess about the data of it, but the heart of these things I do want you to be familiar with. Rating scales, Likert scales can give you the ability to not only talk about averages, talk about kind of where people lie on specific things, but it also, if you want to transition your descriptive studies into comparison studies, or that's relationship research studies that we talked about, can easily do that. And this is kind of the value of these rating scale studies. Much like restricted studies, there are things that they might miss out on, so there are shortcomings to them. But if you look at the vast majority of research done nowadays that fits under this survey research design, what you'll find is most studies do either involve these Likert scales, restricted questions, or a combination of the two, so researchers can get, again, a better sense of what's going on for individuals. Of course, again, if you're collecting information on multiple variables, you're leaving the world of descriptive studies and going into now, at that point, the relationship research that we talked about before, where it can be correlational or comparison in design. But if you're just doing these studies on one particular variable, again, it's often called survey research designs, and it's part of the descriptive study on, I guess, umbrella. I guess it is fair to mention here that many people running these comparison studies do call their research survey research if you are using these types of surveys. If we're looking for things to consider with survey research design, much like we had issues with the observational studies, there are things that are kind of key elements to these studies that you want to keep in mind if you decide you want to run a survey study. One of the things that you really want to do when you're running these studies, and this is a key element to research, is limiting the mess. This is actually something when I teach a senior thesis class that I impart on students over and over and over again. Oftentimes when people want to study a topic, they can think of 20 or 30 things related to that topic that they're interested in. So they'll ask just this huge slew of questions of their participants just because they want to know about this information. They don't quite know what they're going to do with it, but they want to know this information because they think it's a part of their study. You ask people 20 or 30 questions, no matter how well phrased those questions are, it's going to overwhelm people. It's going to oftentimes make them really struggle to be able to stick with the survey and answer things the same way they were answering in, say, the beginning of the study. So limiting the number of questions that you have, limiting the things that you're going to address, is a key element to a good survey. Also making sure that when you do ask questions, they're not overlapping, they're not crammed into each other like the one you see on the right, is big because the brain can get overwhelmed if everything looks like it's too compact and you can't differentiate between the different questions. Another thing that's been encouraged over the last couple of years, and we're going to talk about this twice on this slide, is not asking lots of demographic questions anymore. Historically, lots of social psychology and personality psych and even clinical psych research always felt inclined, or researchers always felt inclined, to ask lots of demographics questions. What is your socioeconomic status? What is your gender or identification? What area do you come from? What race do you identify as? These questions, if they're pertinent to the research, are probably still worth asking, but more often than not, people tended to just ask these questions because they felt like they had to ask these questions, even though they didn't seem to logically relate to what they were interested in. And that can just add to the clutter. It can add that extra wrinkle that can be problematic for studies, especially if you're not going to use that information. And it also can have another side effect, and this is what we're going to be talking about next, called avoiding upsetting participants. Sometimes people in these studies, when asking demographics questions, do just upset people because it's implied when you ask specific demographic questions that those demographics somehow relate to what it is you're interested in. Now, let's say I'm running a study that looks at motivation, and I ask a question about, say, where you're from or what your background is. That definitely implies that where you're from might relate to your motivation or what you're interested in. And that could be upsetting to some individuals, especially if they think there is a stigma associated with their specific group. Another thing that's somewhat closely linked to this is not asking sensitive questions, not asking people things that could offend them, because not only could that sometimes lead to dishonesty, but it can lead to people not responding very genuinely for the rest of the study. In essence, if you make somebody mad, the odds of them doing something in a way that's kind of in accordance with what you're asking them to do is probably unlikely. It sort of relates to the idea of demand characteristics that we talked about before. Another thing that can also upset participants, which falls under this umbrella as well, is just asking questions in ways that either intimidate or upset individuals. Lots of researchers sometimes fall into this trap where they get so familiar with a topic, that they know it in and out so well, that they feel like they can ask people questions that are far too specific and use terminology much too kind of unique to kind of expect people to understand that concept. But once you know it, it's really tough to kind of recognize, and this kind of deals with the concept of egocentrism. It's kind of tough to recognize that others don't know those concepts and those terms. And if you can take a step back when running your research studies, if you're going to use these survey designs, and then think about what's language appropriate for the group that you're asking questions of, it can really help. No, please understand. I'm not saying, don't swear in your surveys. This should just be a given. What I'm saying is making sure that your language level, the kind of words you use and the descriptions of terms you incorporate into things is appropriate for your surveyors, that can really help you run better studies and avoid kind of, again, these ingenuine responses that you can sometimes get. Another big issue with these surveys is who's responding to them. The classic example of this is something we've talked about before, where you get a huge percentage of the population not responding to your surveys. The classic example of this was the Kinsey report, where Alfred Kinsey wanted to know about people's sexual activities back in an era where talking about sexual activity or even sexual interest was really taboo. So he sent mailers out and got a very small percentage of the population to respond to these mailers. But he reported that numbers, exact numbers that he was getting, as if they were representative of the population as a whole, not identifying that really the only people responding were those in the extremes that either were responding in a way that kind of made sure that Kinsey knew that they were not sexually deviant or not interested in kind of unusual sexual things, or ones that were kind of proud of kind of their atypical sexuality or sexual behaviors that they had been engaging in. Kinsey's study is kind of highlighted as a prime example of what happens when we run surveys and aren't thinking about whether or not our samples are representative of the population as a whole. Another thing that can sometimes happen with these studies is because we do walk in with biases, we ask questions in a way that are kind of unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, attempting to prove or kind of push people in a way that we want them to be pushed. If you read the questions above, after we're done with this, you'll see that a lot of these questions are very tinted. They're definitely trying to sway people in their feelings about a specific individual, in this case, a school principal and a school. That really is going to, in the end, not necessarily get representative feedback, but just kind of try to sway people on a specific topic. And obviously, most researchers are not as overt as the research or who I guess came up with those questions on the top. But sometimes these things can happen, and trying to avoid those things is, again, the really key elements to conducting a good survey. And if you can do all of these things, you can have a lot more value with these survey approaches, regardless of which one of the ones you choose to run. In terms of how you can distribute stuff, if you look at the slides and past books, you'll see that oftentimes the kind of comparisons were about whether or not you should do mail surveys, telephone surveys, or in-person surveys. Nowadays, we actually have more options. Obviously, most of us, when we're thinking about running research studies and want to get to a large number of individuals, don't usually go to the mail or telephone anymore. Right? We think about posting stuff on SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or other types of online survey systems where we can just mass distribute these things to a whole bunch of individuals and hope that enough people from random disparate groups respond so we get a good representative study. But just like mail surveys and mail surveys, sorry, there are shortcomings to this. Now, obviously, it's not that having a Qualtrics account is that expensive, but sometimes you do get some non-response biases, or you get very low response rates, which means you have to wonder whether or not you have representative groups. Each approach has its own pluses and minuses, and thinking about these is a key element to conducting a good survey. So that covers the first major types of descriptive research, right? The observational designs and the survey research designs. The other type of descriptive research that we sometimes do conduct are these things called case studies. We've detailed the case studies in the past. Just to reiterate, case studies are when you look at one specific individuals or specific group of individuals, and you're just measuring that small group, not to expand the information of the population as a whole necessarily, but just to get a better sense of how that group itself, which you think is unique, or that individual itself, his or oneself, is unique. Uh, that's a really interesting approach to research, but it doesn't necessarily have lots of avenues that we can explore in today's class. But I do want to mention these case studies because these case study approaches that we run can have kind of a statistical nature to them if we link them up with something we talked about before. Remember back to our last class, which was a couple classes ago, we talked about these things called time series designs. These time series designs and case study designs can actually be combined in a way that allows us to run a really special, unique type of study called a single subject design. After we take a little bit of a break here, now we're pushing almost 40 minutes already, so please take an extended break if you can. We're going to come back and spend about 15-20 minutes looking at these single subjects designs by talking about kind of the nuances to them and also the pluses and minuses with them. And it will be, again, our very last approach that we're going to be talking about. So do give yourself an extended break, come back ready to go, and we'll crank through this last portion of the designs that you can run as a researcher. See you soon. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a little bit of a break there. As I mentioned, what we're going to be talking about in this last portion of the lecture are these things called single subject research designs. These single subject research designs are very unique in that they kind of combine the time series designs that we've talked about previously with these case studies that we've been referencing a couple times in the class in a way that sorts of allows us to explore cause and effect relationships, but not necessarily for groups and not with all the statistical power that we have in most of our research designs, but still sort of allows us to look for causal relationships in specific individuals. And this can either be something we're doing specifically for that individual, or it can be with the idea that if we find something for one individual, we might be able to apply what we're finding to larger groups of the population that this individual could potentially represent. what I always like to do when we're actually talking about these single subjects designs is first break up people into groups and have them come up with some examples of situations where you might be interested in just studying one specific person in different branches of psychology, just so we could kind of get a sense of what it is that we can use these types of studies for. So I usually have people get into groups and they spend about 5-10 minutes talking about a topic within clinical psych or animal behavior or educational psych or cognitive neuroscience that they would really be interested in studying, but maybe couldn't study large groups of people in. And usually what they come up with is examples of kind of either extremes or situations where there's just a unique group that we'd want to study, even if we can't study large collections of individuals. So for clinical psych, it's usually an extreme mental health case or somebody that's getting a rare treatment. For cognitive neuroscience, it's maybe we want to measure how some inability to do something manifests itself in a person when we do X, Y, or Z, or when they've experienced X, Y, or Z. Same thing works for educational psych, where we're maybe looking at a group that we want to try something out with, or an individual we want to try something out with, even if we can't necessarily collect information about large groups or large populations. These are the classic examples of where these single subject research designs can have a lot of utility. In terms of why these things have lots of utility, essentially what we're doing with these designs, as we're going to talk about later, is because we're running these kind of time series designs with these individuals, the ability to look, visually notice that there are effects going on when we switch people from different conditions to different conditions. The issue with these, though, is multifaceted. One of the biggest issues that we have is if we do have large levels of what we call variance, the response rates of whoever we're looking at or whatever group we're looking at from measurement to measurement, our ability to find anything is pretty much obliterated. Also, if we're not controlling for other third variables, extraneous variables, confounding variables, whatever we want to use for that term, we have other issues that again arise. And even if we do find something, the other thing that people always need to be leery of with these single subjects designs is there's no actual way to conduct statistical analyses with these. Stats and statistical analyses require large amounts of variance, well, not necessarily large amounts of variance, but large amounts of measurements that take into account averages and variance. And even if you find something for one person, the representative nature of these studies ensure that it's really impossible to apply what you get from one person to the population as a whole or even to other individuals. But nonetheless, for that person or that group that you're interested in, and you can get a really vibrant story, something that really kind of pops out at you if you do find some type of an effect in these single subjects design. In terms of what we're looking for with these, much like we were looking for in our time series designs, what we do is measure people multiple times in different conditions and just look at changes in their behavior. Now, when we run single subject designs, there's very specific terms that researchers will use. First term that you'll hear a lot about if you do ever encounter a single subject research design are these things called phases, where we're talking about the kind of different conditions or the different groupings that people get put in, and the multiple observations within each of those groupings are called phases. If we're looking for specific terms that we often use for phases, there's two terms that are often incorporated into a lot of experimental studies or clinical studies. The first phase is what's called the baseline phase, where there's either no manipulation being done and we're just measuring something, or maybe if we're looking at kind of a different type of baseline phase, it might be that a placebo is being given and we're just measuring the kind of baseline or how somebody's affected when there's a placebo or no treatment being involved. In the treatment phase, this is where an actual manipulation is being implemented. If we're looking for kind of a tie between this and experimental studies, just understand that the treatment phase is like the experimental condition, and the baseline phase is like the placebo condition, where you've got usually groups being exposed to different things in experimental studies, and in the phases conversation, we're talking about a specific individual getting exposed to different things across the different phases. And if we want to be a little bit more specific, what you'll often see people talk about is the kind of combination of numbers and letters when representing different scores and pieces of information. So you'll often see somebody talking about something like A11, which, if we're going to break down that code, means we're measuring somebody in the first phase, phase A, and we're looking at the very first observation, where the second observation in the first phase would be A12. If we go over to the B phase, and since it's the first time somebody's been exposed to B, we'd call it B11. Or move over to the next one, we'd call it B22. Uh, that's kind of what we're looking at with these, with B22 being the second measurement in the second B phase. It's obviously a lot of terminology and we don't need to obsess about the terminology, but I want you to just be familiar with it, be able to decode it, because this kind of stuff is something that you would be kind of expected to know as common nomenclature for this particular type of a study. All right, what I always like to do now at this point in the class is have people get back into their groups and revisit some of those studies that they'd come up with earlier and try to kind of break down what phase effects and trend effects would actually look like. Um, Sorry, what trend effects and level effects would look like with the different phases that they could potentially design for their study. Sorry for kind of misspeaking there. And this usually involves getting together for about 5-10 minutes, having people reassess what they're looking at, and then sharing their responses. Obviously, we're not doing this, which is sort of great because that means we won't go way overboard on time in this video here. But if you've got time, I do encourage you to kind of revisit some of those examples that I'm hoping popped up in your mind when talking about different possibilities for these single subjects designs. And kind of imagine what different phases within this hypothetical design you might come up with would look like, what a trend effect within it would look like if you're finding effects across the different phases or conditions, and what a level effect might look like if you did find one across the different phases or, again, conditions that you came up with in this single subject design that you were thinking about. If you can do that, hopefully you've got a firm grasp of how these things work. And this allows you to understand some very special, nuanced types of single subject designs that are out there. If we're looking at kind of the classic nuanced single subject design that's been developed, it's these designs that we call the ABAB designs. It's not necessarily the only type of single subject design that's out there, but many people argue that if you're looking to prove the utility of some type of manipulation, it's essential that you have some type of single subject design that reflects this A-B design. That's because what it allows you to do is have both a baseline phase, then a treatment phase, and a baseline phase, and a treatment phase happen in succession so that you can find trend effects, you can find the kind of levels effects that we've talked about before, and you can show that these are not just random chances. Just with the basic A-B design, third variables are potentially out there. There's always a possibility that even if you're seeing a trend or a level, that it might be about something else. But if you see that reversion back to normal in the baseline phase when it's introduced a second time, and the same exact trends, the same exact level effects the second time when you go back to that treatment phase, what you see is really clear-cut evidence that there is some type of an effect going on. Now, you do have to always, when you're doing this, worry about whether or not this person's representative of the population. You have to look for possible third variables, and you have to, and this is a big thing, make sure that if you are returning somebody back to a baseline phase, that you don't do it so fast that you're not actually getting them back to where they were originally. The classic example of this is when people are given a drug and they're measured without the drug when the drug is still actually lingering in their system. Maybe you're taking caffeine and the caffeine is not completely worn off 40 hours later, and you're measuring somebody assuming that they're back in the baseline phase when the caffeine is still kind of circulating through their system. Um, it's an issue. There's other issues, but this is still, again, considered the goal for most single subject designs if you really want to focus in, narrow in on how one specific treatment, one specific condition is changing behavior across that variable of interest. If we do want to kind of do things a little bit more nuanced and we want to make things a little bit more complex, another thing that people can often do with these designs is introduce multiple treatments. And in fact, sometimes what people will do when they start messing around with this is mix treatments together, looking at kind of how they impact people alone or in conjunction with other things. The big issue when you start adding all these things is you've got to keep things straight. You cannot get lost in the clutter and lose the ability to clearly assess what's going on with a specific manipulation. And this is why many people, when they do start to involve multiple treatments, tend to focus on other new kind of hybrid types of single subject designs that are out there. One of the common unique designs that people can use when they are looking at multiple treatments or multiple kind of impacts are these things called dismantling designs, where instead of just kind of randomly throwing combinations of treatments at a person, you actually just throw all the treatments at a person and slowly over time, as the name kind of implies, dismantle those treatments, removing them from phase to phase. My favorite example of this, if you're wondering why the heck I showed a dog's rashed belly in this image, is what's called allergy testing. It's not just a random picture of a dog's belly. It's unfortunately a big issue that many dogs and other people struggle with, where they have some type of allergic skin reaction, but it's not clear as to what this skin reaction is to. I guess full disclosure, this is something that's very near and dear to me because I do have a dog that is very nice in that it's hypoallergenic, but he's also a pain in the butt because he unfortunately is allergic himself to pretty much everything, which means he does break out in rashes all the time. So we've had to a couple times run these dismantling designs to figure out what the heck is causing different random flare-ups. So what we'll do in these dismantling designs, as you do in these approaches, is throw every possible treatment that you can think of at him when he breaks out into a rash. So essentially, we give him allergy pills, we prevent him from eating specific types of foods, we prevent him from going out into the yard, we do all of these different things just to ensure that essentially the rash will go away. And then to test what it was that caused the rash, what you'll do is just slowly reintroduce things. So maybe after a couple weeks of being pent up in the house and not being allowed into different places, you let the dog go out into the yard after the rash is completely gone, and you wait for a couple days. Essentially, you put them through that phase where the yard is the new thing that's being reintroduced, to see if the rash comes back. If it does, boom, you kind of know the yard's a part of it. If it doesn't, then you reintroduce something else. So maybe you change the diet again and reintroduce the old food. If that works, great. You're good. Maybe it's something that's in the air. So, after, the dog's still not showing a rash after a couple days, you take away the allergy pill and see if that helped. And maybe that's something that causes the flare up again, in which case, what, you start giving the dog the allergy pills. This dismantling design has a ton of utility to it. It's not just to take care of allergy reactions in dogs and other people. There's lots of different places where this could help. Clinical psych, instead of trying to just see what could work, some people do the approach of throwing everything at somebody and then just seeing if there is an effect of everything. Which thing was the most important, or which combinations of things seemed to be necessary for this person to experience the change that they experienced when everything was being thrown at them. This is especially important when you are using medications or other things that could have toxic effects over time. You want to make sure that you're only using the ones that are necessary to get the effects that you're looking at. This one is, again, one of the classic types of designs where you're trying to look at multiple treatments and how they work, either on their own or in conjunction with each other. You don't want to have the cluttered mess that we talked about in the previous slide. Another one that you can do, which is kind of interesting, is this thing called the alternating treatment design, where you do first have a baseline phase, or a phase where you're throwing everything at somebody. That can vary, but you got some comparison phase. And then what you do in this alternating treatment phase is you actually have situations where you're exposing this person to one treatment at one moment and measuring them, and then exposing them to another treatment at a different moment within that phase and measuring them. Now, a key element to these alternating treatment designs, and this is why it doesn't work in something like the allergy research, is that you can't have carryover effects. Right? So you couldn't, in the allergy test for the dog, allow the dog outside one day and then allow the dog to eat a specific food one day, because it's not like the rash would go away within a day if they were exposed to something. It's impossible, really impossible, to run an alternating treatment design for that specific example. But if there are no carryover effects, no lingering effects, and the impacts of the treatments are pretty immediate, these alternating treatment designs can be very interesting. Right? If you want to say, look at people's confidence ratings when you're exposing them to different environments and conditions, and their confidence ratings do seem to be immediately impacted by different treatments, you can get images like the one you see above, and you can recognize, man, even if somebody's going through something tough, in whatever the top condition is, confidence seems to stay high, even in these conditions, if we're doing blank, but it seems to drop dramatically if we're doing blank. These types of designs can have a very vivid effect if you can be able to distinguish between the effects that these two things are having, but they're very limited as to when you can do them. The same thing's true for dismantling designs, but I want you to be familiar with these because the utility of these is amazing, and the ability to help people when you have multiple treatments of interest in mind is exponentially greater than if you just kind of randomly slop something at somebody like we talked about in the previous slide. So hopefully with these you kind of understand that these single subjects designs can get complex and they can look at a lot, and that's why they have a lot of value, even if we can't do a lot of the statistical analyses again that we talked about earlier. What I always like to do at this point, when closing out this class, or starting the next class, is have people get into groups and talk about what would be linked to their specific ideas that they'd come up with. So if you're using a clinical example and you were looking at how some treatment condition worked, Is there another treatment that you could impart on the person while trying to see how much you could affect them through these different treatments? And if you had multiple ones, could you run a dismantling design, or would you have issues with lingering effects or kind of the inability to throw everything at somebody? If you could you change your study to an alternating treatment design, or would there be concerns with this? And usually this kind of evokes conversations between people. I usually like to go out and actually ask groups what they're thinking, how it works. I usually share answers with the class. And it hopefully really brings home what these single subjects designs are like and also what you could potentially use them for. This is also where we tend to then wrap up these single subjects designs and talk about again what they're used for and what they can't be used for. So again, single subjects designs are kind of these combinations between case studies and these time series designs that we've been talking about. It allows us to look at a very small individual or small group of individuals to get hints at cause and effect relationships that are really vivid sometimes when we look at the kind of feedback that we get in these single subjects charts. It allows us quick, rapid changes from the different treatments or conditions that we put people in. And again, we call these things phases for this particular type of research. And it can allow us to measure not only kind of changes in averages, but changes in trends, which are all different types of effects that we're looking for in these single subject designs. But there are big issues with these when we try to expand beyond just what it is we're looking at. Just because I find that, say, the diet that my dog is consuming causes him to have rashes, it doesn't mean I can say that this specific brand of food will cause every single dog to have a rash. We can show very concretely that something might be impacting one individual, one subject in a study, but the ability to apply that to everybody is definitely limited in these single subjects designs. And there's other issues that can pop up when you're measuring, especially humans, like demand characteristics, where somebody really wants something to work, so they kind of change their behaviors and kind of enhance any placebo effects that are out there. There's also a possibility that there could be third factors that you're not catching that are actually the key elements to shifts that you're finding, or you could just have situations where even if something's working, it's not a very robust effect. They can get lost along the way, especially if you have, as we talked about earlier, high degrees of variability in your measurements across time. So single subjects designs are neat, they're interesting, but what they can do is maybe not as powerful sometimes as some of the other studies that we've talked about. So they're really used in kind of very specific limited situations. That does mark, if we're looking at the end of these single subjects designs, and believe it or not, it ends the talk on different research designs that we're covering. I know we've gone through a lot here. I'm very happy if you're still listening to me that you have found a way to get to the end. Congratulations, kudos on that. We do have technically two more lectures, but they're not going to be extremely long. The first one's going to be talking about ethical behaviors, why it's really important in a research methods class to talk about ethics, and also some of the concerns that you need to have as an ethical researcher. And the very last lecture, which will be very short, is just going to be a walkthrough on what we call institutional review boards and training to kind of be more appraised of different ethical issues and concerns that pop up in research. In particular, we're going to focus on something called CITI training, CITI training. And I'm going to we're going to talk about this kind of extra credit opportunity related to that, where you have the potential to actually train yourself, take some tests through CITI training, so you can not only get some extra credit for the class, but kind of be more capable of getting into labs in the future if this is something that you're aspiring to do. So we're going to close out here today, but just keep in mind, we got a little bit more to go, a few more things to sneak through. And I promise, once we're done with those, you have officially gotten through everything, and hopefully you're prepared for any future classes you're encountering. But again, give yourself a pat on the back for getting through this one. You're in the home stretch now, and I wish you all the best. Take care.